What is a tiny house? Episode 1, the Tiny House Theory series. This series examines the tiny house not as a trend, but as a historical and political structure. These lectures investigate housing, labor, debt, architecture, colonialism, sustainability, mobility, gender, and survival through the cultural figure of the tiny house. This first lecture asks a deceptively simple question. What exactly is a tiny house? At first glance, the answer appears obvious. A tiny house is simply a very small dwelling. Usually it is mobile. Usually it measures somewhere between 100 and 400 square feet. Usually it contains a sleeping loft, a compact kitchen, storage integrated into walls or stairs, and a visual aesthetic associated with simplicity, minimalism, or sustainability. But once we move beyond surface description, the category becomes unstable very quickly. Because a tiny house is not simply an architectural object, it is also a cultural object, a media object, an economic response, and a political fantasy. The tiny house emerged with enormous cultural force after the 2008 housing collapse. It appeared during a period of growing housing insecurity, expanding debt, stagnant wages, ecological anxiety, and increasing distrust toward traditional forms of home ownership. In this context, the tiny house began to symbolize multiple things simultaneously: freedom, survival, simplicity, mobility, authenticity, ecological morality, and escape from debt. Yet the movement is deeply contradictory. Tiny houses are often described as anti-consumerist while simultaneously functioning as luxury commodities. They are described as liberatory while emerging from conditions of economic instability. They are described as environmentally ethical while participating in market systems that continually aestheticize consumption itself. This lecture examines those contradictions by asking, what exactly became culturally powerful about the tiny house and why? Taylor Pierce, in the 2017 thesis, Ideology versus Reality, the Tiny House Movement in America, describes the movement as divided between grassroots sustainability efforts and increasingly commodified forms of prefabricated housing. Pierce argues that the movement contains a tension between attempts to genuinely reduce consumption and the market production of tiny houses as purchasable lifestyle products. That contradiction is foundational to the movement itself. The tiny house presents itself as an alternative to consumer capitalism while simultaneously existing comfortably inside consumer capitalism. Before examining these contradictions, it is necessary to define the object itself. Megan Carraz, in her doctoral dissertation, Tiny House, Big Impact, defines tiny houses as structures generally ranging between approximately 100 and 400 square feet. She notes that they are often designed as miniature versions of traditional American homes and are frequently placed on trailers to avoid certain zoning regulations and building codes. This detail is important. The tiny house is not merely small, it is culturally legible as a house. That distinction matters because many other forms of small dwelling already existed long before the rise of the contemporary tiny house movement. Trailer homes, RVs, mobile homes, cabins, vans, converted sheds, and temporary shelters all predate the current movement by decades or centuries. Small scale living is not new. What changed was the cultural framing. The tiny house became aesthetically coded as intentional, ethical, and intelligent in ways that many older forms of compact housing were not. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why is the tiny house movement romanticized when trailer housing is often stigmatized? The distinction is not primarily architectural, it's cultural. Many tiny houses are structurally similar to trailers or mobile homes. Some are literally built upon trailer chassis, yet the language surrounding them differs dramatically. Trailer housing in the United States has historically been associated with poverty, instability, rural marginalization, and class stigma. Tiny houses, by contrast, are often framed through the language of design, sustainability, craftsmanship, and freedom. The difference is deeply aesthetic. The tiny house movement emerged during the same period that minimalism became culturally fashionable among middle-class consumers. Architectural photography, Instagram culture, HGTV programming, and YouTube house tours transformed compact living into a visual genre. White painted interiors, reclaimed wood, Scandinavian-inspired furniture, hidden storage systems, and carefully curated natural lighting became central to the visual identity of the movement. This aesthetic coding altered how smallness itself was perceived. Smallness became morally elevated. To live with less became associated with discipline, intentionality, and ethical awareness. But this moral framing obscures another reality. For many people, housing reduction is not voluntary. It is economic necessity. The rise of tiny housing occurred during growing housing precarity. Following the 2008 financial collapse, millions of people experienced foreclosure, unemployment, debt expansion, or increasing rental instability. The fantasy of stable middle-class ownership became increasingly inaccessible. Carras situates the rise of the tiny house lifestyle directly within post-recession housing instability and neoliberal economic restructuring. She argues that the movement emerged during a period in which individuals were increasingly encouraged to take personal responsibility for survival under unstable economic conditions. This point is essential. The tiny house did not emerge during prosperity, it emerged during crisis. That crisis reshaped domestic imagination itself. Traditional home ownership had long functioned as a central component of the American dream. Large suburban homes represented success, stability, family life, and upward mobility. Yet, after the recession, these ideals became increasingly difficult to maintain materially. The tiny house emerged partially as a reorganization of aspiration under conditions of economic contraction. Rather than pursuing larger homes, some individuals began reframing reduction itself as freedom. Smaller mortgages became liberation. Reduced possessions became authenticity. Mobility became flexibility. And debt refusal became morality. But the movement also reflects broader neoliberal transformations. Under neoliberal economic systems, structural problems are frequently individualized. Instead of collective political solutions to housing crisis, individuals are encouraged to optimize themselves through personal lifestyle adjustments. Housing insecurity becomes a matter of better personal management. Consumption becomes ethical self-discipline. Survival becomes entrepreneurial creativity. In this framework, the tiny house can function simultaneously as resistance and adaptation. It resists certain forms of consumer excess while adapting individuals to shrinking economic conditions. This contradiction appears repeatedly throughout the house discourse, the tiny house discourse. For example, many advocates describe tiny living as freedom from mortgage debt. This is certainly understandable. Traditional mortgages often require decades of labor discipline. Debt structures shapes employment decision, geographic mobility, family formation, and psychological stress. The promise of a smaller, cheaper dwelling can therefore feel profoundly liberating. Alice Wilson, in the dissertation Architectures of Resistance, Women's Tiny Houses as Spaces of Agency, argues that many women experience tiny housing as a way to renegotiate labor, debt, and domestic control under patriarchal economic conditions. Again, this is an important point. The tiny house is not merely about architecture, it is about social relations. Housing determines labor obligations, access to safety, economic flexibility, mobility, domestic autonomy, and psychological pressure. The structure of housing influences the structure of life itself. This is one reason the tiny house became emotionally powerful. It symbolized the possibility of reducing exposure to systems that increasingly felt unmanageable. At the same time, however, tiny houses themselves became commodities. An entire market rapidly developed around prefabricated units, custom trailers, luxury off-grid systems, tiny house tourism, architectural branding, YouTube channels, social media influencing, minimalist product culture. Simplicity itself became monetized. This is one of the defining contradictions of late capitalism. Even critiques of consumer culture can become profitable markets. Minimalism is a clear example. Minimalism often presents itself as anti-materialist. Yet, minimalist aesthetics generate enormous consumption industries. Books, storage systems, furniture brands, architectural consulting, productivity systems, lifestyle coaching, media platforms. The tiny house participates directly in this economy. Its visual simplicity is highly marketable. This is especially visible online. Most people consume tiny house content. Most people who consume tiny house content will never live in one. Instead, they consume tiny houses visually. The tiny house becomes a fantasy object. YouTube house tours, HTV programs, Instagram photography, and Airbnb rentals transform tiny housing into a spectacle of controlled simplicity. This spectacle offers emotional comfort during periods of instability. Tiny houses appear manageable, understandable, orderly, compact. They visually promise containment in an era of overwhelming economic and informational complexity. The emotional appeal is therefore significant. The tiny house condenses multiple desires into a single visual object. Escape from debt, ecological morality, architectural beauty, reduced labor pressure, mobility, self-sufficiency, retreat from urban stress, authenticity. But these desires often conflict with material realities. Tiny house living can involve zoning insecurity, land access problems, legal ambiguity, isolation, storage limitations, labor-intensive maintenance, infrastructural precarity. Samuel Alexander and his co-authors, writing about the Australian tiny house movement, warn against romanticizing tiny living as simple or universally liberatory. They note that the movement frequently collides with planning laws, land politics, density debates, and broader structural housing systems. This caution is necessary. Tiny houses cannot solve structural housing crises independently, nor can individual architectural solutions replace collective housing policy. Yet the movement remains culturally revealing precisely because it exposes widespread dissatisfaction with existing housing systems. Tiny houses reveal anxiety surrounding debt, labor, consumption, ecological collapse, suburban expansion, domestic expectation, and economic precarity. The movement therefore functions as a diagnostic object. It reveals fractures. Oops, my battery is running low. It reveals fractures within contemporary housing ideology. At the same time, the tiny house also reproduces certain older myths. One of the most persistent is the myth of self-sufficiency. Tiny house culture frequently draws upon frontier imagery, cabin traditions, pioneer self-building narratives, and rural independence mythology. DIY construction culture reinforces the idea that individuals can reclaim autonomy through personal building practices. This has deep historical roots in American frontier ideology. The cabin, the shack, and the self-built shelter have long symbolized authenticity and independence within settler colonial narratives. Even Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden remains foundational to simplicity discourse within tiny house culture. Pierce explicitly identifies Thoreau as an intellectual precursor to contemporary tiny living ideology. This connection is significant because it reveals that tiny house culture is not entirely new. Rather, it reorganizes older traditions surrounding simplicity, wilderness, self-reliance, and anti-urban retreat. But these traditions are historically complicated. The idea of self-sufficiency often obscures broader infrastructures that make survival possible. Roads, property systems, legal protection, industrial materials, digital platforms, and energy systems remain deeply interconnected with tiny house living. The fantasy of complete independence is therefore largely symbolic. Still, symbols matter, and architecture is never merely functional. Housing carries ideological meaning. The suburban home, the apartment tower, the trailer park, the gated community, the cabin, and the tiny house all encode different assumptions about class, family, labor, citizenship, and identity. The tiny house condenses contemporary contradictions especially efficiently because it sits directly between crisis and aspiration, between resistance and commodification, sustainability and branding, mobility and insecurity, freedom and precarity. This instability is precisely what makes the movement historically interesting. The tiny house cannot be reduced to a single interpretation. It is not simply liberatory, not simply exploitative, not simply ecological nor neoliberal. It is all of these things simultaneously. And that contradiction explains why the movement continues to fascinate people internationally. The tiny house functions less as a housing solution for most viewers than as a symbolic negotiation with economic fear. It asks whether life can become smaller, slower, cheaper, simpler, and more controllable under conditional conditions where traditional forms of stability appear increasingly unattainable. Whether that promise is materially achievable remains unresolved, but the question itself has become historically important. If this lecture has focused on defining the tiny house as a cultural and political object, the next lecture examines the larger ideology that made the movement emotionally powerful, the American dream of home ownership, independence, and domestic success.